Hi. In one of my recent videos on free speech, I talked a bit about how dangerous it is to let the PC crusaders of the world attack our comedians. For those who saw that video, I'll put a link to it on the description of this video, that might have seemed like a little bit of an odd tangent at the time. But I felt compelled to say that partly because of my anti-totalitarian values, but also partly because comedy is something very near and dear to my heart. Mainly because for several years in the early 2010s, I wrote and performed amateur stand-up comedy on a fairly regular basis. So in this video, I'd like to explore what I've learned from that experience. But before getting into all of that, maybe I should tell you a few things about myself so that you can better understand my perspective on stand-up comedy. First, I tend to have a somewhat atypical view of the relationship between seriousness and playfulness. Part of that's because I've discovered through the years that when I'm laughing and joking, that's when I'm really being serious. Because when I'm joking underneath the laughter, I'm actually saying what I really think and feel. On the other hand, when I'm being really serious, well, that's when I'm actually being the silliest. Mostly because that's when I'm really lost in the ridiculous labyrinth of my own self-importance. And over time, I've come to see other people mostly that way too. For instance, when other people are bellowing about how outraged they are and about how monumentally urgent and important their personal opinions are, well, that's when they seem the most clownish to me. And conversely, when other people are laughing freely and easily, that's when they're saying the things that really matter. And by the way, if that's a novel idea for you, try this little informal experiment. Try spending half an hour watching our politicians and pundits as they furiously attempt to assert themselves and elbow each other out of the way, as if they were actually performing a type of silly comedic theater, maybe in the style of Monty Python. Then, spend half an hour watching some really hilarious comedians, as if they were actually trying to tell you some pretty important things about life. If you do that, I bet that you'll see what I mean pretty clearly. Anyhow, my point is that one of the main things doing stand-up comedy has taught me is that humor and laughter and comedy are mostly modes of truth-telling, ways of being more playfully honest with each other than we typically are. That's because a lot of the time we speak and hear the truth best while we're laughing. And of all of the kinds of truth we can speak and hear, it seems to me that the most powerful and important ones are the kinds that actually change us. The kinds of truth that alter our perspectives and our perceptual fields, and even what life fundamentally feels like. And I've learned that that's what stand-up comedy is really about, at least in its better moments. Of course, it's okay when it's merely funny, but I don't think that that's what actually makes us drag our sorry asses out of our Naugahyde-covered Barca loungers, change our damn grimy underwear, and trundle off into the dead of night to see a comedy show somewhere. It's not just that we want to laugh. What we really want is to feel ourselves transforming and growing beyond ourselves while we laugh. And the truly great comedians, the Bill Hicks and George Carlins and Bill Burrs of the world, are incredibly proficient at doing that. Basically, a good comedian can make you laugh, but a great comedian will change your world. In other words, doing stand-up comedy has taught me that laughter can serve as a pathway toward human transformation, especially because when we're laughing with real abandon, we're not particularly tethered to more mundane concerns like whether we're being reasonable or productive or appropriate. In that regard, it seems to me that comedians often serve a kind of shamanic function in our modern technological world. That's true in a couple of ways. First, like shamans, comedians occupy one of the very few niches in our world where it's still more or less okay to violate the taboos that govern everyone else's perception and behavior. Comedians are allowed and even expected to be madmen, eccentrics who are not quite right somehow. They're like latter-day oracles, speaking in zany riddles, weird voices, and loose associations, and who are accorded a space in our world to give voice to the forms of crazy wisdom that are mostly denied to everyone else. But more importantly, comedians are like shamans in that they practice the art of walking between worlds. Most obviously, the world of our very pedestrian habits, concerns, and attitudes, but also the uncanny, magical world of incongruity, surprise, and paradox. In this respect, practicing stand-up comedy means allowing ourselves to be filled with a much wider range of sensations and perceptual experiences than average. It means deviating from conventions and orthodoxies in order to explore the wider horizon of life. And I definitely gained some first-hand experience with that during the few years I was doing amateur stand-up comedy. And while I found that it was true with regard to performing comedy, it was even more true with regard to writing it. Basically, for me, writing stand-up comedy meant learning to dwell at length from day to day and from moment to moment in the mostly unacknowledged strangeness of things, the sides of our lives that are truly bizarre and nonsensical, but that we usually don't even notice or simply take for granted. In turn, this meant learning to open my mind to a constant influx of strange, incongruous sensations and thoughts. But sensations and thoughts that most people could actually relate to pretty well, even though they probably didn't know it. At least not yet. Basically, I learned that to be a comedian means becoming simultaneously weird and familiar at the same time, most especially in how I experience everyday life, because that's where the comedic material ultimately comes from. In other words, I learned to start inhabiting my life in a twofold way, much like shamans do. Along the way, I also learned that it's not actually comedians that are the source of comedy. The real source of comedy is actually life itself, the great cosmic joke that we're all participating in. Comedians are just people who are good at opening themselves in ways that let other people access and enjoy life's inherent funniness. But of course, then the question becomes, how do comedians do that? How do they manage to open themselves to life in that strange, shamanic, comical way? Basically, the question is, how do we manage to become comedians? Well, in my experience, the first and most obvious answer has to do with honestly recognizing our personal strengths and weaknesses. The reality of comedy is that some people are just naturally better at a dry, almost monotonic delivery, perhaps like that of Stephen Wright. Others are better at zany, hyperkinetic styles, perhaps like that of Robin Williams. And what practicing stand-up comedy entails, especially in the beginning, is discovering what kind of comedian each one of us can be, and at the same time, what kind of comedian each one of us can't be, at least not successfully. And for most of us, that process requires a fair amount of trial and error. Basically, trying out different things on stage and seeing what happens. But the thing about that process is that it requires a fair amount of courage. That's because, in all probability, a sizable fraction of those experiments aren't going to work out too well. So to become a comedian, most of us have to learn to live through the experience of failure, or at least the sensation of not being completely successful, without letting it dissuade or paralyze us. In fact, I'd say that if you're someone who's really tormented by the experience of being disliked or hated, you need to find a hobby other than stand-up comedy. Because in stand-up comedy, no matter how good you are, the unavoidable fact is that someone will always hate you. And by the way, that's also generally true in life, too. But it's really obvious when you're doing stand-up comedy, especially because stand-up comedy usually occurs in environments where normal discretion and politeness are pretty much out the window. And people will let you know pretty quickly and directly if they think you suck. But courage is also important because I learned that doing stand-up comedy is a particularly terrifying way of being on stage. Part of that's because, for example, if you're playing in a rock band, as I've done for many decades, you always have your bandmates to fall back upon. You're part of a team of brothers and or sisters. But with stand-up comedy, it's just you, the spotlight, and the microphone. It's the starkness of it, the unforgiving simplicity of it that makes it so terrifying. But beyond that, your target in stand-up comedy is actually very small. That is, what you're aiming at is getting the audience to laugh, which is such a narrow range of all the possible reactions they could have. In contrast, if you're playing in a rock band, your audience can feel many different things. At different points in the performance, they can feel happy or sad or excited or calm or whatever, and your performance can still be a success. But with comedy, if your audience doesn't laugh, well, let's just say it can get pretty rough. Anyhow, another important thing I learned from doing stand-up comedy is that you have to buy the audience's indulgence if you want to get edgy or say things that are challenging. Basically, the surest way to have a complete crash and burn experience on stage is to try being edgy without getting the audience's implicit permission first. And the best way of getting the audience's implicit permission is through subtle self-deprecation. If you watch the great edgy comedians closely, you'll probably notice that they're all masters at doing that. And it's necessary because edgy material almost always contains some undercurrent of threat, even if there's a lot of laughter on the surface. That's because what's happening with edgy comedy is that you're asking the audience to take a step or two outside their comfort zones. But the audience probably won't go there with you if they don't trust you, at least a little. And they probably won't trust you if you make lots of edgy, semi-threatening demands on them while simultaneously conveying an attitude of arrogance and/or superiority. So, all things considered in the world of comedy, it's best to err on the side of humility, on the side of being at least a little vulnerable with your audience. Because when they see that you're okay with being vulnerable, it gives them implicit permission to be a little vulnerable themselves, which allows them to lower their defensive shields and to receive messages that they probably wouldn't be able to receive otherwise. And again, when you think about it, that's not a bad lesson to learn in many other areas of life too. But all things considered, probably the biggest lesson I've learned from doing stand-up comedy has to do with learning how to hold on to things a little bit more loosely. Learning how not to cling too desperately to my limiting beliefs, to the ideas I have about myself and about the world that keep me constrained and hemmed in, and that make me smaller than I really need to be in this life. To put it in the words of the great Bill Hicks, doing stand-up comedy has taught me that it's all just a ride, an ongoing choice between fear and love. Sometimes painful and sometimes hilarious, and a whole lot of experiences in between. Stand-up comedy has taught me not to take anything in this world too seriously, most of all, myself. And it's taught me that there's real wisdom in realizing the truth of that. Wisdom in allowing ourselves to really feel it. And of course, in learning to live accordingly. Anyhow, as always, thanks for watching. Peace out.